read from my slides to refresh my memory. In any case, this is a forum on DTCA. That's Defense Trade Controls Act of 2012 and 2015. 2015 is the amendment, otherwise known as DTCB, B for bill instead of act. But it's been passed, so it's all one act now. So we're here to start off with an overview of the Act, its major components and requirements for research in science and technology in Australia, and what likely impacts those will have. So I will start off with an overview of the DTCA. Dr. Carlo Chubb, my colleague from Monash University, will talk about the DSGL, which is a kind of foundation stone for the DTCA by describing so-called dual-use goods, listing them in some detail in something like 380 pages. And then we have Chris Brown from Department of Industry. Why don't you stand up so people can recognize you for the future? So he's representing Professor Ian Chubb's steering group, which over the past couple of years put together the amendment that was passed a few weeks back. And Tina Matthewson's representing DECO. That's the Defense Export Controls Organization, a part of the Department of Defense, which is responsible for monitoring, regulating the Act, enforcing it in effect. Okay, and after they speak, they'll be giving, in effect, the government's point of view on the legislation and the amendments and the processes that have been put in place and that need to be put in place under the law as it stands. And then after that, I will have a short session, 10-minute session, presenting the essence of my submission to the Senate committee recently on the amendment, and Simon Wolf will do something similarly for Blueprint for Free Speech, assuming he calls in on Skype to do so. There's no guarantee about that. And after all of that, then we'll have a question and answer session running until 6:15 or thereabouts. I've just used up all of your time, Greg. Thank you. And I'll just continue on. Well, you could say 30 seconds just to introduce yourself and
yes.
Your society.
Yes, I'm 5 minutes late. Is that correct?
Yes, and you had 5 minutes. That's why you're out of time.
Yes, I'm sorry about that.
But out of my power to dictate here, I'll give you 30 seconds.
Yes. Okay, thanks, Kevin. So, what we're dealing with here is ignorance. We're dealing with a question of ignorance and ignorance in society. There is a view that there are two views. There is a view that ignorance is good, and there's a view that ignorance is bad. Within SSIT, our view is that ignorance is bad and knowledge is good. And not only is knowledge good, but knowledge is necessary for humans to survive. And that's why it pleases me very much in my introductory 30 seconds to welcome Kevin and thank him very much for the work he's been doing in this space. So Kevin, please assist in the struggle for against ignorance and for enlightenment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I shall do my best in my allotted 15 minutes, which are beginning now. The ground rules are that the topic is fairly controversial. There may be differences of opinion both about interpretation of the Act and about the substance of the Act. There are likely to continue to be differences of interpretation. That's one of the problems with it, as I'll get to in my rebuttal. So I'm asking that no one pose questions during people's talks or interject to correct anybody on anything. Questions and answers and interjections and comments can come at the end in the question and answer session. I will be keeping people to time, including myself. Carlo's going to let me know when I'm over. I'll try to get through my stuff by then. Great. Okay, and I still have nothing to show you. Okay, these slides, I will put these slides on the web, my slides. Other people haven't given me permission, so I won't be doing that with theirs unless they give me belated permission. So my slides will go on my company's website, www.bayesianintelligence, as in Thomas Bayes, Ian, I-A-N, artificial-intelligence.com. And if any other slides are available in any location, I'll at least put a link there. What's happening?
The cable had fallen out the crack.
All right. So there's a quarter of my slide. As you can see, it's highly entertaining.
It was working at the start, full screen?
Yes, it was. Okay, so anyway, all of this stuff comes under the Wassenaar arrangement, which is what this slide is about. So the Wassenaar arrangement is something that came about in the 90s in the aftermath of the Cold War as an arrangement between a bunch of Western Allied countries and other countries to deal with the transport or trafficking of military arms and dual-use goods. Dual-use goods are they're things which can be used, put to a military purpose, and in general, they're meant to be things which are relatively straightforwardly put to military use, and so properly under the control of somebody or other. What's going on?
So this screen is not correct.
Yes, it is.
We can see all of that.
There we go.
Yep.
All right, so we're live again. Okay, so in any event, I'm going to have to go through certain things fairly quickly. So basically, the Wassenaar arrangement is this, and then each country has to implement the Wassenaar arrangement in its own laws. So the UK, the US, and Australia have their laws. US has ITAR, Carlo will talk a bit about that. UK has Export Control Act, and Australia has DTCA. The DTCA in 2012, before any amendment, criminalizes the international supply to anybody, international meaning across the border, but to anybody of dual-use goods without prior permit from defense. Supply included publication of research, presentations at conferences, email, telephone conversations, educational programs, collaborations, and supervisions. And I've highlighted the things that the amendment has changed. So in particular, publication of research and telephone communications are now exempted from the provisions of the law, so they can be freely done in dual-use goods. I personally am only talking about dual-use goods. Other people may talk about straightforward military goods, but not I today. Presentations at conferences or oral communications have been exempted. So if you simply communicate something orally, then that is now okay. So presentations at conferences, I put it not in red because it's not fully exempted, and I'll get to that in a minute. If you violate these provisions by, say, supervising a student at distance by email, something like that, then you could be in serious trouble. Serious trouble means 10 years in prison, $400,000 fine, or both. To be at no risk, you engage in no such activity, you move overseas permanently, you seek permits for these communications in advance, or you do research outside of the dual-use areas. So this is not a trivial act. This is going to impact Australia. Okay, so this is just pointing out what the colors are for. So these things are now exempt. Publication, telephone conversations, and oral communications at conferences are also exempted. That's what the blue means there. Okay, so permit applications at DECO are required for every international communication or project or series of communications. Permits may be denied. That's not the main issue here. Presumably they would be denied because we're talking about dual use for military. But more importantly, if they're granted, then there are oversight provisions. It would mean that records would have to be kept for 5 years by law. Defense may come in and inspect your premises, examine any records, any of your equipment at any so-called reasonable time of day, and they can make copies of everything that they examine and keep them. So there are IP implications, of course. So Carla's going to talk more about DSGL, but I will introduce it. The targeted dual-use research includes optical communications, fiber optics, optical computers, neural network computers, high-performance computing of all kinds, grids, array processors, rather low performance computing, integrated circuits with very slow clock speeds. Presumably when the list was originally written, that was a fast clock speed, but it is no longer. Fault-tolerant computing of all kinds with exemptions. I should mention that the DSGL is an extremely complex document, so it lists fault-tolerant computing, and it covers a considerable variety of fault-tolerant computing, but it also lists exemptions. So if you're doing hot backup computing, that's okay. That's specifically excluded, so it's not targeted. Cryptography, bacterial and viral pathogens. So in some communications, how much time have I got, Carla?
Only about, you've used up 7 minutes.
Okay. Bacterial and viral pathogens. In some communications, people have suggested that it's only extreme pathogens that are affected, but I looked at the list and it includes foot and mouth disease, which is an ordinary target of research in Australia. Foot and mouth disease has yet to hit Australia, but it might be nice to be prepared for it. But if you're doing research, for example, computer simulation of foot and mouth disease, then you need to be aware that you will need a permit to deal with communications concerning it if those are outside the publication pathway. Satellite technology, imaging, signal processing, composite materials, and for me, rather importantly, robotics. All of artificial intelligence can be used in a dual-use way for military robotics, and so at least potentially all of artificial intelligence is covered by the law. Okay, the UK, in their act, have this passage, which is quite straightforward, quite simple, and protects the education and research community more or less totally. The communication of information in the ordinary course of scientific research, the making of information generally available to the public, the communication of information that is generally available to the public. All of those things are explicitly exempted by this passage. US exemptions have a similar effect. They're a lot more complex. But the main point is that in both the US and the UK, ordinary science and education are exempted from the corresponding laws. Not so in Australia. In Australia, what people seem to be relying upon is the DSGL itself, because the DSGL itself has certain exemptions. It exempts basic scientific research, it exempts research that's in the public domain, it exempts patenting information. There are some important caveats to this, however. In particular, the first one, basic scientific research, is qualified. It has to be research where the primary purpose is not applied. If there's a primary purpose of applying the research, then it's not covered by DSGL. So that means that linkage grant work, for example, would not be covered. And a lot of discovery and NHMRC projects are also intended for application, especially NHMRC. Okay. In the public domain, of course, most research is not about public domain information. It might be using public domain information, but the goal is to produce new ideas. So the DSGL exemption number 2 is irrelevant in those cases. In any event, there's a bureaucratic headache in monitoring and figuring out what is and isn't in the public domain, as a number of people have pointed out. So this is great for expanding bureaucracies. University administrations can explode as they never have before. They've been exploding, but they'll explode even faster. Okay, so the main changes in the 2015 Act are the publication track exemption. Ministerial interventions are possible. The Minister for Defense might intervene and decide that your publication cannot go ahead. That would presumably be extraordinary. Oral communications are exempt. Lots of people have said that this basically covers international collaboration and we're in the free and clear. But that's just absurd, because most communication internationally is no longer oral. You don't get on a boat and sail to Europe and talk to people. Even when you're physically present, giving a presentation. What is giving a presentation? I'm speaking orally with you now. Everything that I say, right, would be exempted were we relocated to, say, Singapore. But this information would not be. If this was the first available transmission of information, and it was on a dual-use subject, and I put it on the local machine, which I did, and the machine belongs to the local organization and not to me, then that's a criminal offense. If I get up and stand up and say that information out loud after the fact, it's still a criminal offense. Communications, here's another provision of the new law, the amendment to the old law. Communications to and from the APS, the Public Service, Defense Forces, the police are exempt, so they can communicate freely to and from Australia. Offenses are brought under the criminal code. Ian Chubb seems to think that this is a great advance because then proof of intent in violating the law would be required for successful prosecution. I'll respond to that later. Publication track. So, these are just a couple definitions, basically. Intangible supply is basically meant to capture internet communications. That's one of the strongest motivations for introducing the law, is that the prior law was dealing with paper-based kind of communications primarily, and they want to bring it into the internet age. Publication, pre-publication communications are exempted. That includes refereeing and things like that. So that's all fine. But what is not exempted, these are examples of things that are not exempt. Teaching international students, MOOCs, these could become exempt, of course. They could become exempt by all of the information being communicated being first published. Okay? But if it isn't, then it's criminal. Remote supervision, international campuses, again, the same considerations apply. If you're communicating any new research, which we're all obliged to do according to our teaching and research model, that you bring new research into your classes, then it's not exempt unless you first publish it. Conferences without publication, there are some researchers I've been in communication with who don't believe in that these things exist because they work in domains where they don't exist. But there are lots of sciences that are covered by the DSGL. And for example, my own conference, Bayesian Net Modeling Society, held in New Zealand, does not publish. The workshops affiliated with major AI conferences are also not published. So all of those things become good opportunities to get yourself arrested. International collaborations, as I've mentioned, by email and so forth, assuming that you don't get permits in advance. Invited talks when you carry things around on USB sticks. There is a view about that verbal exemption covers all of this, that it's perfectly okay, that you're safe, but that's a confusion about verbal and oral. The Act says oral. It does not say verbal. It would be a very different Act if it said that verbal communications were exempt. And I've run out of time. That's okay, so that'll go to questions and answers because we won't be having any right now. So, Carlo, you've got 15 minutes.